Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Master Case Writing, How to Write a Successful Teaching Case Study. My name is Sarah Anderson and I'm the Cases Marketing Manager at Emerald Publishing. Before we start the session today, I just would like to mention a couple of housekeeping items. So the webinar is going to be recorded and will be sent to the email that you registered with following the session. And please feel free to share this with your colleagues. If you prefer, you can also find a PDF of the presentation slides in the handouts section on the panel on the right-hand side of your screen. The session should last 1 hour, and if you want to ask questions as we go, please feel free to put these in the question panel, which you'll find on the right-hand side of your screen in the GoToWebinar viewer. And we'll make time to answer your questions at the end. And on that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. So first up, we're delighted to welcome Lesley Symons, founder of the Case for Women, which conducts research into the presence of women in case papers with the aim of improving their presence in business school learning tools and their representation in the education sector. Lesley will talk about her research and the Case for Women competition's mission. Next up from Emerald Publishing, we have Melissa Close, our Cases Publishing lead, who will talk about how to develop a case study for publication, including top tricks and tips to avoid the most common pitfalls of writing. And Melissa will also give you details of 3 of our case writing competitions that are open for entry now. And finally, we welcome Valerie Suslow, who is Professor and Vice Dean for Faculty and Research at Hopkins University. And she acted as editor for the Case for Women competition for the last 2 years, managing the process of review of all the submissions alongside an editorial assistant. Valerie will share some final suggestions on how to ensure a successful submission from her experience as editor. So now I'm going to hand over to Lesley to get us started the session.
Thank you. So good morning, good evening, afternoon, wherever you are in the world, welcome. I'm really happy to be sharing this research. It's my morning, I'm in Australia. So where are the women and the visibility of women in business school case studies? And I've set this in the area of writing a successful case study. And I have probably read many thousands of cases over the years. And just what we have seen and what we have come up with when thinking about writing a successful case study. So if you're thinking about writing a case study or have written one or about to write another one, these are some of our thoughts on writing that case study and thinking about it. First of all, it's not just about the topic. So you might be writing a case, say, around economics and have a specific point you want to get across. However, it is about the whole story of the whole case that is really relevant and thinking about that. So how does that whole story represent itself? So in other words, how would your students read that case study? How would they look at the whole story? And what are the subliminal messages that your case study could be emitting that perhaps not thinking about when writing about your topic? And a big thing for me is about, if you can read it, you can be it. So again, if you can't see yourself or you can't read yourself in these studies, you can't be it. So when writing a case study, does it reflect today's workplace? Does it reflect the diversity in today's workplace? And how is your protagonist described? Are they described? And do you notice in your paper or study the balance of genders or the balance of diversity in your case? And does it entrench perhaps some old systems? And does it show stereotypes? Because we're still seeing this happen. So let's go into, why did I do the research originally? Again, it's back to, if we can read it, we can be it. And this really comes from my experience going to a business school, spending a year and a half at a business school, reading many case studies and having one case study only with a woman in it. She was the leader, and she was doubting her leadership style, but that was the only case with a woman in it. So I was sitting there going, where am I? As a woman in business, where am I? The other thing is business schools play an integral role in developing leaders for the future. And it's a topic of current debate. There are more and more women entering into business schools right now. And it's the underlying messages that women and men get about women leaders, or leaders of any diverse background. So what the research shows us, you will see, is women are not seen in business. They're not seen in these studies. It could tell women that they are not equipped to lead. Often she is the lone leader surrounded by many men, and that's even in the latest papers we're seeing that. And it validates entrenched old systems. And again, it shows women, perhaps this might be not a safe place to be because it stereotypes women's roles. So let's look at the context of the research. They are actually the case center case studies. And I did this because it was part of the learning mix for MBA students. I analyzed how women are portrayed, and I also set this in the original context of a women building their leader identity at business schools. So we have 14 years of research, and this includes the latest case center case study award winners as of, I think they were announced yesterday or the day before. Over that time, there's actually been 140 award-winning case studies. There's only 139 because one case study won twice. And the award-winning are across 10 categories, and they're the most widely distributed across institutions. We then cross-reference with 3 best-selling case studies every year. The reason there's only 7 is because it's the same papers that are the best-selling every year. And when we talk about best-selling, it could be just the number of papers being sold. So it could be one institution buying 500 or 300 papers. So in total, though, we have 146 different cases. So this is what we found. Out of the 146, 144 cases have men in it. 97 cases have women in it, and we might say hooray to that. However, we deem that women are really only present in 66. What does that mean? That means she plays an integral role to the case. So in other words, if she is mentioned as a wife of the CEO, she is in the 97, but she's not in the 66. In 49 or nearly 50 cases, there's no women in them at all. So let's look at the protagonists. 146 case studies. There's 111 male protagonists, and there's 17 female protagonists. However, only 14 cases were originally women, because we do know that one professor originally wrote them as male protagonists and changed their names to a female protagonist because he was aware that his female students were not seeing female leaders. However, he didn't change the descriptors. In 7 of these cases, she is the only woman in the paper surrounded by men. So let's look at how these studies have changed over time. This is really interesting. So we look at, this is just women in the papers in the studies. And as you can see, we saw a growth up until about 2018, and we felt that, in 2019, when we were looking at this, we felt that this was probably the quick wins happening, adding more women into papers. However, and dare I say, I don't know, since COVID, it's dropped back again to 66%. So if we look at the protagonists over that time, you will see here that really not much has changed, and almost we've gone backwards. Then the number of characters, men still outnumber on average 5 to 1 in cases. So let's look at some of the themes around this. So invisibility of women leaders, so no role models, pink topics or places of work, the prevalence of men, or the think manager, think male syndrome, and that comes from Virginia Shine's research, where she took, and she did it twice, MBA students, asked them to describe leaders, and both men and women described a manager or a leader with descriptors that we would consider as male. And there was no interaction of women with other women about the business. So if we look at the invisibility of women, I'm sure most of you know the Bechdel test or the Mo movie test, which is a way of measuring women's presence in movies. And it says it has to have 2 women in it who talk to one another about something besides a man. And you can still find this online, and it is still being measured. So I took this and said, okay, let's put this idea towards case studies. So a case study has to have a woman in it, because we want to encourage more women in cases, which we're seeing a little bit of. And then encourages, who is the protagonist? And it encourages women to be shown as leaders at any level, and who speaks to another woman about the business. And that ensures that she isn't the only woman in the case study. And I know for our competition, this is an integral part of the competition, that the case study passes the same Symons test. And hopefully you can understand why from this. Of the 146 case studies, we know 97 have a woman in it. We know 17 is where she is a leader. However, there's only 5 cases where she speaks to another woman about the business. And so this is why this is the main reason why we put this into the competition. So let's look at some other themes, some pink topics. So the op-ed project is a project that looks at where women are in print, and they generally fall into the 4 Fs, which is fashion, food, furniture, and family. And these are women-focused subject matters, and that is mainly where they are in print. And if we look at where the women leaders or protagonists cases are, 12 of the 17 fall into what we call a pink topic. In the male protagonists, the largest sector is IT and mobile communications. So if we look at what we call the think manager, think male in case studies, 146 cases, 144 mention a man. Of the 111 male protagonists, the descriptors are something like they're tough but fair, they're results driven, and they're a father figure. Often we also find in these papers that there's often a founder of the business mentioned and described too, and more often than not, they're male. Of the 17 female protagonist papers, 14 of the 17 protagonists are not described at all. So let's look at who's writing these papers or studies. Primary writers are male, and what we call secondary writers are male, although there seems to be more female as a percentage writers in the secondary writers. So both men and women writers are not writing about women. Of the 68 female writers, over 51 cases, only 6 papers have women leaders. 159 male writers, only 14 papers have a woman leader. 14 cases are written by women, have no women in them at all. 43 cases written by men have no women in them at all. So what could this mean really for case studies? And and for you writing your next case study. So there's no examples of different ways of leading. So there's huge opportunities here, I believe. It prevents men and women learning about the value of different genders as leaders. It really ingrains old systems of hierarchy and business practices and really doesn't represent today's workplace, and continues to underrepresent women and diversity in these case studies. So what could this research mean for students? So we talk about first and second generation gender bias. And I don't talk about first generation, which is really outright discrimination. But here I'm talking about the invisible barriers that inadvertently support men. And these papers show second generation gender bias. So for instance, there's few women in leadership, which could say to women and everyone that where they are, they're an exception. Where often women are, they're shown in strong stereotypical roles as wives, as EAs, PAs. And where there are women leaders, it often shows her alone, which could say that women don't promote other women, which we know is not true. There are pink areas of work. In other words, there are specific areas where women can lead and be. And obviously, there's no role models. You can't read it, you can't see it, and you can't be it. And more, there's male-dominated hierarchies. There's the think manager, think male leadership styles. It could also say that men sponsor or advocate for other men in their like, because there are so many men in these studies. And it shows structures that favor men, so inflexible work structures. And what effect could that have on women? So it's the double bind effect. Management is masculine. So if I lead like that, I might be respected, but I'm disliked. And if I lead in a different way, I might be liked, but I'm not respected. It also shows visibility. You know, when you're different or a lone woman, you're highly visible. And what does that mean? It means it increases your stress. And what we've known from research, it actually reduces the motivation to want to lead. So women and people from diverse backgrounds not seeing themselves in these studies reduces their motivation to want to step up and lead. And then there's also some potential identity conflict between the identity as a woman and identity as a leader. And there's a total lack of showing of any networks for women. So just some reflections for you, or key themes to be aware of in your case writing. Back to, how are your students reading your case study? And what could be the subliminal messages or hidden biases that could be in there? So reading between the lines. And again, it's more about the total story. What descriptors are you using for male and female characters, if any? Are women speaking to other women in the business and about the business? Does it reflect today's balance of characters in the workplace? Because at the moment, these case studies are not. And a leader need not be a CEO or an MD or a board member. The majority of cases that I've read over many years, the male leaders are middle managers. They are not a CEO or an MD or a board member. For your key teaching note, just to keep front of mind, how does your teaching note reflect your case study and vice versa? Is there any discussion or topic about gender in the teaching note? Does there need to be? Does gender play a role here, or is an under the surface bias? So could it be brought up in some way? And how comfortable are you with this topic? Do you need learning in this area? And finally, thank you. And I want to challenge you and everyone to be the change that we want to see in these case studies. And good luck for the case competition. Thank you. I will now hand you over to Melissa.
Yes, thank you. That was a great presentation. I'm going to share my screen now in a moment. So just give me 1 second. If someone could please confirm that they're able to see this now, that would be great.
Yep, we can see it.
Perfect.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. So my portion of this presentation is going to focus on publishing your teaching cases by going through the mechanics of what is required in both the case portion and the teaching note portion. I am the cases commissioning lead at Emerald Publishing, and as such, I work on the Case for Women competition alongside Leslie and Valerie. So I will also be highlighting at the end those upcoming opportunities to submit your case and potentially get published. I have a brief agenda for the remainder of this session of what I will go through, and then I will be handing over to Valerie for her insights as the editor of the Case for Women itself. So to kick off, I wanted to share just a brief overview of the Emerald Case Collection so you understand kind of the ecosystem this competition lives within. So our portfolio contains over 2,500 teaching cases with teaching notes. Within that, we have the Case Journal, which is the home for the Case for Women as of 2023. So if you choose to submit, you'll be submitting through the Case Journal, or TCJ, as we commonly call it. We also have the Emerging Markets Case Studies Collection, which has a couple of other opportunities coming up if your case doesn't particularly fit within the scope of the Case for Women. And we also have a number of other collections as well that can be accessed through that link if you want to have a browse through everything we have available. And I think one of the reasons we kicked off with Leslie's slides is that they provide really good context for thinking about your own plans in writing case studies and why in particular you may want to write a case. I think that this format is very well situated for real world impact. So when you are writing cases, you are making these contributions to pedagogy, you are highlighting these perspectives in your classroom that you may not have seen in the literature elsewhere, which is incredibly valuable and engaging for your students. You're also commonly working with these tangible real-world examples, going out to companies, interviewing their managers, and then bringing that into your classrooms as well to show students what this is actually like once they graduate and move on to their own careers. And as this next generation of business leaders evolves, your cases have a hand in teaching them these valuable skills, lessons, and competencies that they are going to use for their future. So I think Leslie's slides in particular are very inspiring to highlight some potential gaps that you could look to fill as an author. And as you're getting started, I just wanted to briefly provide a kind of definition of a case so that we're all starting from the same page, because the Case for Women competition and our other collections, we do not accept research cases. We accept specifically teaching cases. And within these, they have two distinct elements that we look for in a submission. The first is the case portion. So this is the document that is visible to your students. It has this distinct narrative style where you're telling the story of this dilemma that a company is facing. You're following a protagonist as they explore this dilemma and potentially look to solve it. And this is the section that is laying out pretty much industry knowledge, any relevant history you might need to know, and the details your students are going to be working with in order to analyze that case. The teaching note is the secondary portion where you're really providing your value as an instructor, as someone who is knowledgeable in this area, and this portion is not visible to the student. So this provides all of the insights you might need in order to adopt this for a classroom, and we keep this hidden just to instructors in order to not spoil any of the answers per se, if the students were able to read through and essentially know what happens at the end. So now I'm going to talk through both of these and their various parts in a little bit more detail. starting with the key elements of the case itself. So the case typically contains 4 major things that we look for. The first is this core dilemma, and this is the overriding issue that's pulling together all the various parts, and it's most frequently a managerial issue or a decision that requires urgent attention. So for instance, you might have a company that's looking to expand, and the question is that your students are investigating, how should they do this or where should they do this? And everything within your case needs to be carefully curated to build up an argument that they can pull together to give them the data that they need or the perspective of the industry that they might need. We also do frequently see a protagonist. So this is the central figure in the business who is facing that management decision that Leslie talked about in great depth. The background is included in the case portion. So this is all the relevant details about the history of the industry, the business, that will allow those students to understand the case. And then finally, the hook, which is the opening paragraph, which is going to grab the reader's attention and is going to introduce the key details of the story. In the case portion, you don't want to go ahead and tell the students what actually happened. We encourage you to save that for the teaching note portion in case the instructor decides that they would rather hold on to that information so it doesn't bias the student's perception in any way if they already know what happens. So instead of thinking creatively or collaboratively, they're trying to mold their own vision to the outcome they already know happened in real life. It just allows them to be a bit more free thinking when they approach all the potential various solutions to a case, because we find that the most engaging cases are the ones that could have multiple solutions. To dive down a little bit deeper into how you can actually take those 4 sections and write out your case, in that hook, which is your first opening chunk of your case, we are essentially selling the reader on if this is a compelling story that you should use within your classroom. And we find that it is very effective when your opening paragraph starts with the 4 W's. So you have to cover a lot of ground in this section, because frequently when instructors are looking for cases to adopt for their own classroom, they're only going to give it so long before they move on to something else. So you may only have a minute or so for them to jot down those key details that they're looking for and identify that, yes, this is a case that I want to use. So in this opening paragraph, you should talk about who this case is about, what they are doing, why they are doing this project, this initiative, etc., where it's happening and when it is happening, so that this reader can see that it's very timely, it's very topical, and it's going to address those needs that they have in their classrooms. In the body of the case, please tell the entire story, usually in chronological order. Please also contain all that necessary background information that we were talking about, and try to be concise here. We find that sometimes when authors are researching, they get a lot of really good information that, while interesting, is not necessarily relevant to the case itself. So it might be a bit extra, or it might just be fluff that could be used elsewhere in another project. We encourage you, when you are writing, to essentially do a little bit of a sense check on your background. So when you move on to the teaching note portion, you'll know all of the outcomes you are hoping to accomplish with your students. You'll have these goals, you'll have questions. We encourage you to look at those objectives and those questions, and then come back to the case to match up the different sections to ensure that all of the information you need to answer those questions is present in the background. So for instance, if you're asking your students to accomplish a SWOT analysis in the teaching note, your case should provide all the necessary details and history and company background to identify strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. If it doesn't, you might want to add in some more detail. And if there's a bunch of stuff you're actually not using, you might want to tone it down a little bit for the sake of space. And then lastly, on this point, you can tell more than one side of the story so that students can think of competing alternatives and get a very healthy and lively conversation going. In the concluding paragraph, this can provide a short synthesis of the case to reiterate those main issues and even raise new questions. And you can also include any necessary exhibits that are going to supplement the facts of the case and provide students with that key information for discussing the dilemma. I wanted to pause here on some frequently asked questions that we receive about case studies that we've received from our authors over a number of years running these competitions. One we frequently hear is, can a case be disguised? The short answer to this is yes, a case can be disguised. Disguising a case is the process of changing a certain number of details, perhaps the name of a company, where they are based, or even in particular instances, what industry they are in order to receive consent for publishing that case. Emerald does require consent whenever primary research has been conducted with an organization, and we understand that sometimes companies can be a bit hesitant about releasing sensitive information, or they can be a bit sensitive if they feel that they are not being positively represented in a particular case. So in those circumstances, we welcome you to disguise certain elements. However, we do ask that you please be transparent about this and reflect any changes within your methodology in the teaching notes so that the editors can be aware of this as they are working with you to revise your case. A second question we receive frequently is, can a case be based on secondary research? Again, the short answer to this is also yes. So secondary research is anything that is publicly available. You do not need to ask the company for permission to publish this because it is already freely available for use. You just need to make sure that you're citing everything appropriately, that everything is referenced, and also please make this known within your methodology in the teaching note that you have based your case on secondary research. How long should a case be is the final question we receive a lot. So we encourage cases to be within about 5,000 to 7,000 words. We feel that that is a good amount of space to cover the necessary elements. However, we do feel that we have experienced rather that the most popular cases tend to be on the shorter end of the spectrum. These get picked up the most often for use in classrooms. And we do also accept compact cases, which are really concise, about 1,000 to 3,000 words. So you can find yourself in any area of that spectrum and we will consider your case happily for publication. I'm going to move on now to the teaching note portion, and right off the bat you can see that this slide is much longer than the case slide. This is because this is what is really going to sell your case to those potential adopters, those faculty that are looking for specific things within their courses to fill. So there are a lot more sections here to cover. The first is a basic synopsis, which you've probably worked on already in writing the case, but it's basically the short description, the context, the dilemma being faced, and the discipline that this case is relevant for. The teaching and learning objectives are the outline of what is intended for this case to accomplish. They should be appropriate for the stated target audience. So if you're targeting this case to undergraduate students, you should not be asking them to ideally do any work that a graduate course would aim to accomplish. Make sure that they are scaled appropriately. Your research methods, they explain the types of data being used to create the case and how it was gathered, and as well as if you are disguising any information, as I mentioned. The teaching plan is something that can be a really good tool for providing a roadmap for how to use this class, to use this case in an actual class. So we encourage you to approach this from a 90-minute lesson perspective. You can include multimedia plan suggestions, such as, suggestions for teaching in an online environment, any kind of breakdown of the timings, such as spending about 10 minutes on the opening discussion before moving into those classroom questions and activities, etc. It just helps the instructor know how to plan their time in order to make the most out of this particular case. We also include a number of assignment questions with sample answers. So these have to be aligned to the teaching objectives and related to the dilemma being faced. Everything, as you might be getting a sense of, is very focused on that dilemma and those objectives. So when you are starting to write, it might actually be a good idea to start with those objectives and the dilemma and then move on from there to make sure that everything is tied together and you are accomplishing the goals that you set out to do. You can include any references you may have used to help analyze the case and provide answers to those questions. Instructions for online use can be quite helpful, especially in this day and age when more and more courses are being conducted in an online environment. And we know that engagement in these online spaces can look a little bit different than in person. And then finally, this is where you conclude your epilogue of what actually happened next. So once the conversation has wrapped up and the teacher decides it's time to reveal the real world outcome, they can share this and then reflect on how it might be different or the same from what they've decided on as a group in class. A couple of the notes for what makes a good teaching note. Those suggested class times are indeed very helpful and something instructors look for, so please do be sure to include those, including that brief description of the opening and closing 10 to 15 minutes of class, challenging case session questions with sample answers. So we want them to be something that's thought-provoking and engaging and not too simple where they can just give you a quick, couple sentence answer. You want to make sure that students are putting some work in. And then any supporting materials such as worksheets, videos, readings, reference material, etc., can be very helpful to make your case stand out. Remember that this is how you're going to sell your case to potential faculty all over the world for use in their classrooms. Lastly, some final tips for success in my final minutes. We encourage you to classroom test your case. This means that you'll get a round of feedback from your students before you even actually send it in for submission, and they can provide a number of questions, a number of feedback to help you identify any gaps in your case that you can address before you even send it in. And it's also a really good sense check for how engaging it actually is. We encourage you to also write your case with a target audience in mind. So again, keep in mind the differences between undergraduate and graduate students. If you need a way to help scale this, we encourage you to look at Bloom's taxonomy when setting those objectives. We also ask that you please remain objective and consider all sides of a dilemma just to make it more engaging and an unbiased experience. And then finally, ensure all those sample questions in the teaching note are supported by the case itself. Some common reason cases get rejected, and then I believe from here I'll be talking about some resources and publishing opportunities. Number one, if a case does not adhere to author guidelines, this is very simple, but we unfortunately do see this happen quite frequently. So a really easy way to ensure that your case might get past this desk reject shade is to check off everything in the author guidelines to make sure that you've listened to our requirements. Secondly, the case does not follow standard teaching case conventions. So by this, I mean there's a couple of things we look for in our submissions, such as, case characters should be referred to by their last names. And also it should be written entirely in the past tense with a professional and engaging tone. If the introduction is too long, such as not being able to identify that who, what, where, when, and why, or the dilemma, readers might be less inclined to pick it up, which means reviewers might feel the exact same way. If the case is not self-contained, this might also be a reason reviewers will pick it apart. So it is important when you're writing to make sure that you're providing all that necessary information so that students won't have to go out and do a bunch of external research just to understand what's happening in this issue. Poor quality of writing is also common. The case has an unclear or inadequate dilemma. An underdeveloped teaching note are frequently things we see, which might be something you can look back on and do one final check before sending in your case. The case is fictional because we do not actually accept fictional cases. They have to be based on real world scenarios. And lastly, the case does not have consent of the protagonist or the organization to publish. I'm going to briefly highlight some resources in my last couple of minutes. So the first one I wanted to highlight is the Cases Learning Hub. This is a completely free online module that you can use to go through the entire process of writing your case from the very beginning of identifying a need, setting those learning objectives, all the way through to evaluating your case study before you send it in for submission. And as you go through this module, it's completely go at your own pace, and it will track your progress as you go through these little blue bars. And you will find a number of resources such as videos from our editors, helpful infographics, question and answer sections, and also a number of just helpful breakdowns of key terms and methods you might need to know in order to successfully complete your case. On the Cases Hub, we also have a couple other modules as well. These include Teaching with a Case Study, which if you're looking to become more confident in facilitating the case method in your classroom, this might be a really good one for you. It's got a lot of helpful tips on provoking that exciting and engaging dialogue and also choosing cases that are right for you. Learning with Case Studies is a module that you can assign to your students alongside any case you might be using. And this helps them to prepare adequately for class. So as they're reading through the case, doing their prep work, It asks them a number of questions to identify things such as who the protagonist is, what's happening, what the dilemma is, what are some potential solutions to this dilemma, so that they have a slew of notes available to them before they even get to the discussion portion of your class. So hopefully they will come ready to engage and dissect this case. And then finally, we have a number of useful resources that include past webinars, sample cases, and a number of writing guides for you to use completely free. All you need to do is register. And one last book is the Compact Guide to Compact Cases. So if you're interested in the compact format, which is about 1,000 to 3,000 words, as I mentioned, this will provide a number of annotated cases, examples, helpful checklists, roadmaps, and writing prompts for you to practice on. And it is available now for purchase. I wanted to now talk about your publication options and why I hope you will choose Emerald and one of our competitions for your own case. So first off, we do pay all of our writers to EMCS and TCJ. If you are the winner of one of these competitions, you will also include a portion of our prize funds within that publication. And as part of publishing with us, you become part of this extremely collaborative community who share ideas and best practices. I found that the case writing community is very much a passion motivated community and has been great to work with them. Our publications are both fully double-blind peer reviewed and Scopus indexed, which I think really speaks towards the quality of our editorial teams. As an international publisher, we are also well staffed and prepared to disseminate your work to an international market. And then lastly, tracking, we have the ability to see who is downloading your case and where it is being cited, which I know is very important for faculty looking to make sure that their work is having an impact. These upcoming opportunities that I keep referencing, one of them is the Case for Women competition, which Leslie talked about a little bit in her slides. So I wanted to share the submission information for this. We will be accepting cases until the 15th of April of this year. We have a total prize fund of $12,000 that we will be splitting among the top winners. And I think Leslie summarized the scope of this very well in her portion, but essentially we are looking for cases that feature a female protagonist in a positive way. She speaks to another woman over the course of her work on this dilemma in the case. And ideally, we would have a mix of gender and a mix of industries included in the batch of submissions that we received this year. So if you do want to submit to the Case for Women, I encourage you to visit that link at the top of this slide to read through our author guidelines and then make your submission through the case journal. One other submission opportunity we have available is the Indigenous Voices case competition. So this competition was prompted by the historical underrepresentation of Indigenous authors and protagonists in the case literature. So we are looking to hopefully provide a very diverse and timely collection of cases by the end of this, once we are publishing the outcomes of this competition. It will be open for submission until April 30th of 2023. We have a prize fund of £2,000, and this is open around the world as long as you have both an Indigenous protagonist and an Indigenous member on the author team. And then lastly, the final competition I would like to highlight is the Seaman case writing competition. So this competition is welcome to all authors around the globe as long as your case focuses on an emerging market. It accepts submissions up until April 30th of 2023. We have a total prize fund of €4,000. And if your case does not particularly fit into the scope of the Case for Women, for instance, if it does not have a female protagonist, I think either of these competitions could be a great home for your submission. And with that, that was my last slide. So I believe I'm going to hand over to Valerie. So I encourage her to come off mute for her editorial and judging perspective.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Melissa. And thanks everyone for attending. I am going to spend just a few minutes building on the very comprehensive presentations that you've heard from Leslie and from Melissa, with some additional tips from an editorial and judging perspective. I am here in the tips I will give you, channeling some of the information that I have seen from our judges or reviewers over the past few years. So if we can move to the next slide, I will get started on the positive side. Some of the most compelling cases share these features. And so the first one I would say is building on one thing that Melissa said about having tangible real world examples. I would say that that is one of the great benefits of using the case study method in the classroom, right? There are other pedagogies that one can use, but sometimes a great case is one that describes the decision-making process of the protagonist. So this is something that takes the students and the instructor as well behind the scenes with, although it could be based completely on secondary research publicly available, some of the most compelling are those where there are interviews with the protagonist, so that the case study reveals something about the decision-making process or the leadership challenges, the options that were weighed in the process of resolving the case dilemma. Most of the time what we see, it was written about a company or organization, is the decision that they made, right? Not the ones that were considered and set aside. So this can be part of a very compelling case. The other thing is that it tells part, but not all, of the personal and business story. And on the personal side, I will say Leslie mentioned that of the very small set in her research of cases that have female protagonists, the overwhelming majority are not described, right? Or were not described. I can tell you in the case for women cases, that is not true. Those case authors who are passionate about writing for the case for women definitely want to spend time and do spend time telling part of the personal story of the entrepreneur or of the female CEO or C-suite or manager, whatever that is. We have to be careful, right, that it also has to be relevant. And so it's sort of the relevant part, not all of the personal story, and the relevant part of the business story where, as I think Melissa mentioned, right, the end of the case should not be the conclusion. It should leave you, the student, with the puzzle, right? The case dilemma hasn't been solved yet. And so there's this question that pulls you in at the end. A little bit more matter of fact, but important, right? Some of the best cases, the case dilemma aligns very closely with the assignment questions. That's very important. And the learning objectives, and this is very common, the very best cases, they progress from fundamental sort of students should understand such and such to students should be able to analyze, evaluate, right? Examine, weigh different decisions. And that's very important. Melissa mentioned the undergraduate student audience. We often very much the judges and through the editing process also have in mind the graduate master's level students, and so the questions, it's very helpful for them to progress. Sufficient information for an in-depth analysis. I'll come back to this one on the flip side of where cases can go wrong, but I included here because there are many cases that are strong that include that from the beginning. And this one judge's comment, although it could be seen as a negative, I have it in here where the judge said as part of the review, there's insufficient financial data unless this is meant purely as a managerial case. And I wanted to add that, and that is perfectly fine, right? Some of the toughest challenges, right, are the management and leadership challenges. And so that's fine. It just needs to be clear that that's the focus, right? And then the teaching note, as was already mentioned, must have, right, a general framework, theoretical framework, managerial framework for analysis and case questions that are appropriate for undergraduate and graduate students. So let's switch to the next slide. And here I will, because we learn from things that go wrong. The most frequent feedback for either minor or major revisions, and I will add, again, building on what Melissa said, that the vast majority of these are very fixable within one round of sort of revise and resubmit. If the case author is able to put in the time to do the revision, these things are all fixable. So writing errors, spelling and grammar inconsistency. So there's a similar word that's used throughout and it's spelled in different ways. All of those things, obviously, the more you can do to submit a very polished case up front, the better. This is something that guaranteed, right? The judges and the reviewers and I would in the editorial role, and other editors of some of the other case competitions that Melissa mentioned will key in on this right away. So it's helpful to submit a case that has had careful proofreading already. The writing being too casual. I point this out. Different writers have different styles. There are different norms, right? Depending on if it's writing about a solo startup or writing about a leader of a multinational company, but avoiding very casual language is preferred, because again, you have in mind that these cases could be disseminated to schools around the world and to graduate students as well as undergraduate. Sort of too many dilemmas, talking about so many things because there's so much to tell about the story of the protagonist or the company, that leads to a lack of focus. And so it's great maybe for another purpose, but for a teaching case, it helps. It helps the instructor, it helps the student to see what the focus is. And then the teaching note, again, the theoretical framework from management literature is very, very important. Too many frameworks to choose from can again be confusing. So highlighting the one or two key frameworks and relating those to the case questions is best. And so the last slide here with some tips is the sufficient product, company, market context so that students can analyze the case dilemma and propose solutions without external research. And I have some quotes here that you can take a look at. I feel that this is very important. It is something that Melissa mentioned, but compared to the other things that I've mentioned, this can be something that will hold a case back from ultimately being accepted for the collection, because it is it happens frequently that there's a very compelling story. It's clear that there could be an interesting dilemma or business challenge, managerial challenge for the students to analyze, but they simply don't have enough information to do anything more than take a superficial stab at what the protagonist should do or what the business or organization should do. So it is often the case that there's more company information that's needed, more about the market environment, so the competitive landscape or the market segments or the characteristics of the current demographic or the prospective demographic. So basic pricing, basic financials, again, if it's relevant, depending on what the dilemma is. So it could be that, for example, in here we see some quotes on there's interesting analytic work here to explore, but there's just not enough contextual information, right? Or the case describes a remarkable businesswoman, but the students need more information. What were the factors that needed to be considered? What was the potential downside? So it is very helpful to think about this as you're writing the case, and obviously you can't cover everything, so it's just enough information that the students can think about, use the framework to think about how would they resolve the dilemma. And it's okay if part of it might be, it would be helpful for them to do a bit of external research, but it is typically something that the reviewers or judges will comment on if the case says that the instructor must assign some outside readings or outside research for the students to do the case. That's not sort of what the preferred model is. So it's helpful to have all of that included. And with that, I am going to turn it back over to Melissa.
Perfect. Thank you, Valerie. So right now we have a few minutes left to go through some Q&As. So I'll invite Leslie back. There you are. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see everyone as well. And hopefully Sarah can take a look at the chat and throw some questions our way.
Can I mention something?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Can I mention something, Sarah?
Yes.
Okay, just for the case for women competition, just want to clarify where we would like to see sort of industries cases from, because we mentioned the 4 Fs. Now, we're not saying that we won't take from a study that's within the 4 Fs categories, but we would love to see cases that are outside of the 4 Fs. So we're not holding women to those areas of to those areas of industries, because I think on the slide it looks like we want them within the 4 Fs, and that's not exactly the case.
Yes, that's a good point of clarification.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so the questions are starting to come through now. So feel free to just type into the question panel if you've got anything to ask, and we'll read out your questions and try and answer them. So the first one I have here, does the language of the case have to be exclusively in English?
Yes, we accept only English submissions, unfortunately. There are a number of services out there if you're not a first language English speaker or writer that can help you if you're nervous about translating your case to English, but unfortunately it is only English at this time.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, a few people have just been asking about the slides and whether they can have a copy of them. So I mentioned at the beginning, and I just popped something in the chat as well to say there is a handouts panel where you can download the slides, because they won't be circulated in the email afterwards. If you've got any problems finding them just now, then just send an email. If you reply to any of the emails, that'll come to me and I can send them on to you individually. And so the next question is, are the competitions annual?
The Case for Women is annual, as is the Seaman competition. This is the first time we'll be running the Indigenous Voices competition, so we'll have to see if there's enough interest in it to have another go around, but very much intending for these to all be annual.
That's great. The next question is just, I can pick this one up actually. So someone's asked about whether they can have a certificate of attendance. Yes, you can. So a follow-up email will come out tomorrow, and attached to that you'll have a certificate of attendance. Right, so next question, what evidence is required by Emerald about the case authentication, especially when writing a case with disguised identity?
So if you have used any kind of primary research, we do require that letter of consent. We have a consent form on our website that you can download and have someone at the organization, the company, fill it out. Typically, a member of the executive team that you've been working with, though anyone authorized to sign on behalf of that company can fill it out. And you attach that alongside your submission to know that you have gained that consent. For the purposes of disguising information, we do ask that you note that down in your research methods section in your teaching note, and we trust that in doing so, if you have gained consent of that organization by disguising it, so they will have read through everything that you've disguised to approve of those changes. So that consent portion is still needed even if you are disguising it. Hopefully that answers your question. And Valerie, if you want to add anything on, please feel free. Okay. And if your case is based on secondary research, you do not require consent because it's all freely available information.
Thanks, Melissa. The next question was just about the book on case studies. So I've just dropped into the chat the link to that book there for anybody who's interested. What if the company is not providing consent?
So this can be a tricky situation. I encourage authors to be very transparent with the companies they're working with right off the get-go, so that they know in the end that your goal is publication and that you are going to be asking them for consent. That can set you up on the best possible foot to have a good relationship and make sure that you get that consent by the end of the process. If disguising is necessary, that is another avenue you can go down to make sure that someone at the organization is happy to provide you with consent. If you are not able to get consent, even after going back and forth trying to disguise it, I'm afraid that Emerald would not be able to publish that case because it is a matter of both protecting you as the author and protecting us as a publisher to make sure that the case studies that we are producing are not going to put us in any threat of these companies coming back to us or you in the future and saying, you know, I didn't give you the okay to publish this, or that you've misrepresented me, so on and so forth. So being transparent, working with them to make sure that it's properly disguised, if that's something they require, are all things that you can pursue. If you have specific questions about your situation, I would encourage you to reach out to someone at Emerald so we can discuss those circumstances and see if there's another way we could find a path forward.
Great, thank you. So next question, we've still got a few more. Someone's asked, can they get a sample format or guideline of a case study?
I'm happy to answer this one too. Sorry, I'm speaking so much to the rest of the panel. We do have a number of sample cases available on the Cases Hub, so you can either register an account there, and it's under the Useful Resources tab. We actually have a previous case room and case available there, so you can have an example to compare against as you're writing your own case, or you can just send me an email and I can send you through some examples that way.
Okay, thank you. Are there options for case studies targeted at non-business courses?
So yes, we do for things like executive courses, accept those kinds of case studies. Emerald, however, is very much within the business and management space. Most of our content does cater towards business school settings, but there are a number of other publishers out there where it might be more relevant for whatever you happen to be working on that you could pursue.
Okay. Sorry, just there's some comments in here as well, just trying to pick out the questions now. So a couple more questions, and then I think we'll wrap it up. But we can follow up with any questions if you still want to post some more in the chat. So do you publish cases where the main protagonist prefers to be anonymous? And then there's a second part to this one as well. So he's followed up with it. The company does collaborate with all the information to build the case, but in the published case, they want to use a fictional name.
So this is an interesting question that kind of gets at the boundaries of disguising cases. Changing names is something you can do, but again, we ask you to be transparent about the fact that you've done this in your methods section, as well as if the company's organizational name changes as well. So you can change someone's name so that they're not easily Googleable, essentially, so that someone can maintain that kind of air of anonymity. For the purposes of these competitions, however, there are some very important aspects to their identity that are embedded into our scopes. So for instance, the Case for Women competition itself, if you were changing a protagonist to, in the real world, they're not actually a woman, they have a different name, but you wanted to make it fit into the competition so you could still submit, that would not be something that we would allow for the purposes of this competition. You're welcome to submit to our regular collections, TCJ, and the emerging markets case studies for publication, but you have to follow the scope of the competition if you want to be considered for one of the prizes.
Great. I think that is all our questions for now. So yeah, do you want to wrap up, Melissa?
Sure. I wanted to say thank you again to Leslie and Valerie for spending your time with us, providing your insights. To our audience, I hope that you found this session useful and that you do decide to send in your case studies. We look forward to reading them and reviewing them. And if you have any follow-up questions after this session, please do feel free to send me an email and I can get back to you in due course. Thank you so much for your evenings, mornings, wherever you are based. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye.